Hi everyone, wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We're back for another edition of Trev Talks, the packaging sustainability podcast. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Richard Lampit from the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton as this time's guest. Hi, Richard.
Hello, Trevor. Very nice to be with you.
Brilliant. Richard, I'm delighted to have a professor, first and foremost, on the podcast because having someone with an actual qualification puts me to shame. You describe yourself as an observational biogeochemist. For our listeners, could you please explain what that is?
Yes, that is a bit of a long word. Observational, that's kind of as written on the tin. I go out to the ocean and I observe things, make measurements, put instruments in the water. Biogeochemist, that's this mixture of a bit of biology, and it's not the geo bit isn't geology, it's world, as in the geoid. So it's biology of the geoid, the world, and a bit of chemistry, and that also throws in a bit of physics. So it's trying to pull all those three aspects together to get an understanding of the way the oceans work.
Fantastic. My 10-year-old would absolutely love to do what you do. He's fascinated by all of those things. So I'll make sure that he listens to this podcast. So today, Richard, for those that don't know NOC, as I like to call it, please could you explain a little bit more about what NOC is trying to achieve down in Southampton and how that relates to your day-to-day job?
So NOC is it's now a charity. In fact, it used to be part of the Natural Environment Research Council, but it's now a charity after the last couple of years. And our objective is really to do outrageously good science, educate the public, politicians, influence policy, develop new equipment, new methods of observing the ocean. We're the biggest oceanography centre in the UK, about 600 employees, and we are a very forward-looking organisation to really try and make a difference locally in the UK, for instance, but also globally. It's got to be a global issue when it comes to the oceans.
Absolutely. What a thoroughly exciting organisation to work for, one that's truly making a difference. And what would a typical week or day look like for you?
Well, I guess one of the really nice things about it is there's nothing very typical. But let's say when I'm at sea, and I go to sea for about 4 weeks in the year, something like that, usually on fairly long trips, sort of perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. And on those, it's a matter of making observations, putting equipment into the water, and I'm normally running the cruises. Oh, cruises, no, we shouldn't call them cruises, they're expeditions. That has another meaning. So I'm normally running those expeditions. And so there's perhaps a staff of about 20 scientists, and then the ship side people as well. So that's spending a lot of effort trying to put equipment in, do experiments on board the ship. These are research vessels, about 100 meters long. So that's the seagoing side of it. The lab-based side of it is I have a small team in the what we call the microplastics research group. And so this is really both a combination of doing analytical work, actually analyzing samples that we get, putting proposals in to fund the work that we do, which is actually a very hard thing to do, and writing papers either for the scientific press or for the public, doing presentations to talk to the public and lecturing on the subject. So it's a real big mixture, and that's what one of the things I really like about this particular job.
And for our wider listeners, let's say our younger listeners, because I've got a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old who are interested in lots of different topics, what would you say to them if they were interested in getting involved in this type of business?
Well, I do actually get asked this quite a lot, and I spend quite a lot of time talking to students, school children from way up at 5-year-olds upwards, and some of them want to be involved. And I guess the first thing is in their education, keep it as broad as you possibly can. So I know lots of people, and I was asked this just last week, they want to do marine biology. And my normal answer to that is make sure you've got lots of other things behind you in addition to just marine biology. Doing marine biology is wonderful, but what you've got to do is make sure you've got some maths, physics, chemistry to support it. So that's the usual sort of answer that I give to younger people who want to get into this. It's highly competitive to get into it. I mean, I was lucky, but a lot of people, it really is very, very competitive. It's very difficult to get in, and once you are in, you've got to, as I said, you've got to keep bringing in funding to support your work. Which is, in the past, I've had most of my funding has been through Europe, European funding, and I coordinated a couple of big proposals, big programs in Europe. That's obviously much harder now. But so we had a large amount of the resources coming through Brussels. So it's much more difficult since we left the EU.
Thank you, Richard. I think that's going to be really helpful to a lot of people. I think that the big challenge for the youth of today is to have some sort of idea of where you want to go at such an early age. And although I'm now in my 40s, perhaps it wasn't so different back in our day. You just weren't too sure. And I love that advice to be as broad as possible, because I think a lot of students end up in a particular degree or placement that they think is the right thing to do. And life doesn't work out that way, does it? It's not linear.
Here's a quick message from our sponsor, Aura. This podcast is brought to you by Aura, bringing together leading consultancy, pioneering technology, and data-led insights to help organizations meet environmental compliance and manage sustainability every day.
Fantastic. So the really exciting part of the conversation for me is hearing about the topics that you get frustrated or you're most interested in debating when you're sat down at the dinner table on a Sunday. And that's where Recycling Room 101 comes into the equation. So today, Richard, you've got a few topics that you'd like to try and get into Recycling Room 101. And I would be grateful if you could describe very briefly the top line of what those three ideas are.
Right. Well, I guess the first one, when it comes to plastics, that labeling such as this is a bioplastic, or it's biodegradable, or that it's compostable, this is a this is a thoroughly good thing to have labeling like that, because it advises the public.
Okay,
I can
so
put that out if you like.
okay, so certain labeling is very important, and we should have it on plastics. And the second one?
Well, the second one was that hang on, what was the second one we were going to talk about? The second one was on that plastics and are responsible for global warming. That we've clearly got a serious global warming issue, and that plastics are in some way that they contribute to this warming that is going on.
Okay. And the third one, as I recall, was that glass or aluminium foil should be encouraged as a replacement material for plastic.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of people feel that we've got to avoid having our materials in plastic bottles or wrapped up or whatever, and that the best thing to do is to wrap them up in tin foil.
Okay, so let's take one at a time.
Yep.
Let's talk about labelling first. So, what is the general consensus and what's your opinion on labelling?
Well, the general consensus, I guess, by the general public, which I do absolutely think is right, is that labeling should be informative. It should help us to make decisions when we go to one in the supermarket aisle or whatever. When we go to one product, we want to make a decision: is this better for the environment than the neighboring product? And that's absolutely right. Now, the real beef is that, and my absolute pet hate, is that the labeling that we've got for plastics is completely unhelpful, if not misleading. And one doesn't want to point too many nasty fingers at industry, but there certainly are many instances where the labeling is absolutely misleading. So if we think the term compostable, great, it's compostable. So maybe we just throw it in the river because it's going to break down or whatever, or we can put it in our garden compost bin and it'll break down, or if we put it in the trash can and out, it'll get broken down. Many cases, in fact, almost all cases, what's meant by compostable is that if you put it in an industrial composting facility, which is at 60 or 70 degrees, it will break down. This is a completely, and that's great, if you can get it into an industrial composting facility. But for the vast majority of cases, this is completely irrelevant. So saying that something is compostable is usually, that is designed to mislead. Similar, even more so, is the word bioplastic. When people see bioplastic, they think, oh, great. So it's pretty much the same as my lettuce leaves, which I might put in. It's biological material. Nah, not true. But you can make plastics out in all sorts of ways. You can have it from hydrocarbons, from oil, or you can make plastics from agricultural waste or from fruit, whatever. All sorts of ways you can make plastics, and they are both equally damaging. There's really, in many respects, there's no difference between a bioplastic and a plastic produced from hydrocarbon. It's just where did the carbon come from in the first place? So this is another thing which is designed to mislead the public by saying it's a bioplastic.
Would you go as far as to say it's greenwashing, Richard? Would you go as far as to greenwashing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really not appropriate.
And on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most cynical individual alive and 1 being incredibly naive, how cynical are you when you look at this labelling?
Well, I'm certainly very cynical at the moment, so I'd put myself on an 8 or 9. However, I am a glass half full sort of guy, and I think there's going to be some changes which will take place over the next 5 or 10 years, which will make sure that the labelling is appropriate, and that will also be matched with the new plastics which are being developed. And new technologies which are being developed to treat plastics. So I'm actually quite optimistic that in the next decade there's going to be great improvement. But at the moment, really pretty cynical about these, and I think they just should be banned. I think it's completely inappropriate to mislead the public in this way.
So that's a really important point there. You said at this point in time you believe these types of labels should be banned, I guess, until there are absolute rules and regulations around the claims.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to get those standards sorted out. We've got to get the new plastics, which are going to do it, as I said, and the new methodologies for dealing with these plastics at the end of their life. But at the moment, this is just really bad news.
Yeah, I think that you can just walk up and down your own road where you live, and if you were to ask your neighbours, what does this label mean to you, they'd all give you a different answer. We work in the industry. We're paid our salary to understand these things. And actually, it's still incredibly difficult to define. I read an article just last week which said there's over 494 different labels that have been audited for sustainability with regards to packaging. When you get to that number, you've got to guess or accept that probably 80% of them are meaningless. And even trying to explain to someone the difference between bio-based and biodegradable, or what is compostable versus industrially compostable, these are not terms that people understand at a standard day-to-day level. And I think that you're absolutely right to call it out, because without clarity, we're only going to cause more harm to our recycling streams and to our environment as an extension of that, because we're going to end up spending a lot more fossil fuels dealing with the challenge. and the onward impact of that on recycling, reuse, etc. So yeah, very, very interesting. So let's move on to the second idea, perhaps a myth that glass or aluminium foil should be encouraged as a replacement material for plastic. Could you elaborate for us, Richard?
Yes, well, that's something which is becoming more and more widespread with the lot of negative press about plastics. And I probably should have started off by saying I believe plastic is the most wonderful material. It does really enormous benefit to society at large and to the environment. Anyway, so going back to this question of replacing plastic and this encouragement that we should avoid things in plastic and go for glass or aluminium foil. What one really needs to appreciate that you can't really treat the global environment or even your local environment in isolation. You need to think about the carbon footprint. And that's the crucial bit, that plastic is a very cheap material to generate. It has a carbon footprint, that's for sure. Whatever, 5-8% of the world's hydrocarbons are used to generate plastic, but it is very light, and it is very all sorts of other very positive aspects to it. Aluminium is extremely energy intensive to produce. It's got a very big carbon footprint. Glass has a fairly big carbon footprint, but it's very heavy. So transporting it around the place generates an awful lot of CO2 emissions. So those two methods of protecting material, which we have to do, we really need to package things. And I'm not just saying this to you, Trev, because you're involved with that industry, but we have to package things to prevent them going off, to prevent them breaking, etc., etc. So, but the idea that what you want to do is to replace that packaging with aluminium foil or with glass is very often completely misplaced. And yet a lot of people are really thinking this is the way to do it. And I know as an example that some organizations, their carbon footprint is increasing because in the supermarkets, people are walking past the bottles of their fizz in plastic bottles. They are going to pick up ones in glass bottles because they think that's much better for the environment. But actually, it has a much bigger carbon footprint. And our carbon footprint is something we have to be mindful of.
Absolutely. Such an interesting conversation, and one that from an educational perspective is going to be so important over the next 20, 30, 50 years, if not forever. I was actually at a conference last week, the Net Zero conference in London, and there were a number of protesters outside the conference who were rallying against organizations that use plastic. And I won't name the names of the companies because that would be unfair. But these protesters clearly had the planet at heart. They had the right idea. But actually, upon talking to them, it became apparent that their passion was in the right place, but perhaps the facts they were dealing with weren't necessarily the truth. And I'm not saying that I know the answer, because I don't sit here as a human life cycle assessment machine. I've not done every single calculation that you can possibly do on every single piece of material, because that's impossible. But I think it's far too reductive to blame one material and to say eliminate plastics. They have, as you say, so many practical, logistical uses that it's not as simple as that. And I think that only through education can we enable the next generation or even the current generation to put their energy into the right cause. But it's hard. And I think you could sit there and say, well, plastic is good, but if a supplier is buying that plastic from 4,000 miles away and then transporting it another 8,000 miles, that doesn't mean it's better than glass or aluminium. So interesting challenge. How would you fix that?
Well, the fix is going to come in better plastics, different types of plastics. It's going to come from industry. That I feel absolutely sure. So the links between organizations such as mine, which are, if you like, a pure research organization, and industry, have got to be very good and I think probably improved. But we need to get better sorts of plastics, and there are lots of them being developed at the moment. And we need to educate the public in how they deal with the plastic that they get hold of. So the mantra of buying less, reusing, and then recycling, and at the very, very last resort, actually throwing them away or putting them in landfills or incinerating them. So it's partly public awareness of this and changing public behaviour, which happened, I mean, in the plastic bag tax, of course, which a lot of people, which happened in the UK, a tax put on plastic bags, and this had a massive reduction, very small tax, but had a big reduction in plastic bags. And even though in totality, this may not have been terribly successful, because lots of people then bought what were called these bags for life, and then they went on buying them because they kept on forgetting to bring them to their shopping. But nevertheless, the really good thing was that it focused the public's attention on this environmental issue. And that was a really a sort of hidden benefit to it. So we need to change behavior. We need to change the plastics that we generate, and we need to change industrial behavior in the way we deal with the plastics that at the end of their lives. So it's a number of things, and we need to probably change regulations as well. That's another area which I'm also involved with, but that also needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Hear you loud and clear. Okay, so the third and final opinion that you want to propose for Recycling Room 101 is that plastic pollution is responsible for global warming. So, Richard, I'm really curious to hear your opinion on this one.
Right. Well, this is something which I've initially, when I heard people putting those two terms together, plastic pollution and global warming, in the same sentence, I thought maybe I just misheard it or something, that people were. And then I kept on hearing that quite a lot of people really didn't tease apart those two areas. They were more or less the same thing. And in fact, I've read on a number of occasions and heard people say on a number of occasions that plastic pollution causes global warming. No, really, 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 it does not cause global warming. It is a pollutant in the same way as you might say generating CO2 is a pollutant, although there's quite a lot naturally around. But plastic is absolutely not in the same class and does not cause global warming in any way, shape, or form. Now, that's perhaps not completely true, because the pollution in the oceans, which I know a little bit about, it is possible that it will affect the way carbon is cycled in the ocean, and it may affect in some way the way the oceans take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's not completely true to say that it's completely a different story. But the idea that plastic pollution causes global warming is really, it's not based on, in fact. They are both issues which are hard to address, and both issues that we need to address if we're going to prevent this sort of damage that we're doing to our environment.
Okay, so I think that it's interesting because the phraseology in there is so important. It isn't that plastic pollution is a good thing. Clearly, it is not. It isn't that global warming isn't a real thing. I think we all should accept that it absolutely is. It's conflating the two as directly relational. And what I'm hearing from you is that pollution itself is not the direct cause of global warming. And is it fair for me to say then that the production of packaging and plastic, without picking just on plastic, is a direct contributor to global warming?
Well, not really, because I mean, what's happening to these hydrocarbons is that when we use oil or any other carbon source, we're then making it into a product. We're making it into this plastic material, which then exists for a period of time until it ultimately breaks down. So and then ultimately releases the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But that is a long-term process. Some people say plastic never breaks down, it's there for thousands of years. No, not true. It does break down eventually. Some sorts of plastic just break down rather slowly. And when they do break down, they will release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So so if you like, that's the way it works. It's sort of holding up, instead of just burning your hydrocarbons, you're holding it up in this repository, this storage, which is the plastic that we've got.
Okay, interesting. So if you were having a conversation with your family and they said, well, what's the one thing that we should be focusing on? What is the major contributor to climate change? What would you say to them, in your humble
Oh, for
opinion?
the climate change, it's the old chestnut of turning the thermostat in your house down, so you live at a colder temperature, or in warmer climates, not having your air conditioning on, driving less, flying less. These are the sorts of things which we really need to do, and encouraging our industries to use less, or to generate less highly polluting materials. Aluminium, I've already mentioned that aluminium takes a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of energy, when actually quite a lot of it is generated in Iceland using hydrothermal energy, but it uses a lot of energy to generate it. So there are certain things that we want to probably avoid. And those are the lifestyle changes that we can make as individuals. Getting on our bicycles, for instance, for shortish journeys. Those are the sorts of ways that we can make a difference. And even though we're a small country, the UK is a small country, even us, we can make a difference. And that's what I always encourage people to do on their daily lives.
Okay, so we've discussed your three ideas, Richard, and I think the one that connects most with me is misleading labelling. Labelling is so important to inform consumers on how to recycle effectively and help them make decisions. However, if we place misleading labelling onto packaging, this can actually have a negative impact. And I really liked your example of made from bioplastics. This is suggesting that this plastic, this packaging is great, that it's going to be good for the environment, and it will shape consumer perception, when in fact it could be damaging to the environment. So I believe wholeheartedly it's essential we help consumers to understand how to appropriately handle their packaging. And in doing so, we need accurate labelling that fairly reflects how it should be recycled or treated in an environmentally friendly way. We need better regulation, don't we? We need more honesty, more accuracy to drive this change. And so for this reason, I'm going to place misleading labelling into my Recycling Room 101.
Great. Excellent.
Excellent. So we got to that part of the show where we're going to teach Trev a new fact. I'm always interested in learning. Can't say that I'm the most learned individual in the world, but I love a fact. So what fact would you like to share with me and the listeners today?
Right. Well, there's always a danger that I'm going to be criticizing an individual company, and that's a dodgy thing to do. But I could just be a bit bland about it and just say that some people have this idea that you can clean up the ocean, that you can, and I get asked this often. All we've got to do is we've just got to clean up the ocean, and we can do that by, in all sorts of ways, towing nets to clear out all this plastic. And my usual response to that is, so if you're going to clean out the small particles, say those ones less than a millimeter or so, which are the ones which probably do the most harm, you're going to take out most of the animals as well, and that's not a good idea. So the fact is that there is a particular attempt to clean up what's called the North Pacific garbage patch. This is a patch in the middle of the North Pacific which has got quite a lot of large plastic bits floating in it. The large plastic bits are actually a very small proportion of the total, less than 1%, but nevertheless, they are prominent. And this particular company has the idea that they're going to tow nets through it to clear this lot up. This is about 1,000 kilometers off California. So the fact is that they hope to remove 6,000 tons of plastic per year. At the same time as doing that, I've done the calculation, and I've had this checked by several of my colleagues, that this will generate about 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So the fact is, you can retrieve 6,000 tons of plastic, but you produce 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And when I say this to people, they say, well, we want less of both. We want less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we want less plastic in the ocean. Now, you can't do it both ways. In this instance, if you collect the plastic, you release the carbon dioxide because it's a long way offshore, and you've got to get the ships back and forward. And that's leaving aside the energy costs of processing this plastic. So that's my sort of, if you like, reluctant to talk about it being a fact I'm going to give to Trevor, because you know a lot about a lot of things. But that's the fact which is so often is missed, that the cost of doing this is very large.
It comes back to your point around the true carbon impact of packaging products in our society. One thing I would like to ask, though, is the solution then to, one, do nothing, okay, which I know sounds slightly confrontational, but it's not meant to be. Two, to wait until we have better technology to solve the problem. I'm curious as to what you would do if it was your task to deliver.
Right. Well, that's actually very simple. Well, I think I have the solution to that. Is quite simple. Is not to try and recover it from the ocean, but to stop it getting there in the first place. That has got to be, once it's in the ocean, I think we just kiss goodbye to it and say, we've just got to wait till it breaks down, sinks to the bottom, and that's it. What we've got to do, and actually this company that is doing this attempt in the North Pacific, they are also doing absolutely the right thing, which is to develop ways to recover plastics from the rivers. The rivers contribute probably a substantial, if not the vast majority of material going into the ocean. There's lots of other ways, but rivers are important. And you can then use a passive collector to collect this material as it's flowing down the rivers. And obviously we hope that it doesn't get into the rivers in the first place, but if it does get into the rivers, then you can recover it that way. And that's what this company is doing, along with many other companies. And that's the right way to do it.
Very interesting. I'm very pleased to have had that conversation with you, because I have certainly learned something. Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Trev Talks. I hope you've enjoyed it too. To our listeners, thank you very much for taking part. Please like and subscribe if you want to be involved in future content. Thank you, Richard. It's been great having you.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thanks for listening to Trev Talks. If you'd like to be featured, or you've got a question you'd like us to discuss in the next Trev Talks episode, simply drop me an email using the email address in our show notes. Trev Talks is brought to you by Aura. Aura brings together sustainable packaging consultancy, pioneering technology, and expert-led insights to positively impact your business and our planet. Find out more about how Aura is helping leading businesses to achieve their sustainability objectives. Go to www.aura-consultants.com.